All right. I think we're close to around the RSVP list, so I'm sure folks might join in or drop out, but I'll go ahead and get started here. While we admit other folks in the waiting room, if you're able in the chat just to drop your name and the organization you're with today, it helps us to know who all is here. Get started with that. So as a reminder, so today is a webinar. It's actually being hosted by CCLT, and unfortunately, Kay had a last minute emergency and has not been able to join us because of that. But we are focused mostly on the data elements today, which are protected lands and how they get counted for in 30 by 30. So we thought it was okay to go ahead with the webinar, as this is only one of many. But we do want to thank them for hosting and Claire for taking care of a lot of the meeting logistics for us. You should have gotten notice when you joined that we are recording, and that way if there are things people need to come back to, that'll be available. We'll send out the link to that. And the slide deck also is available for you. And I tried to include URLs where helpful. So as I mentioned, I'm joined by Claire. She is helping us facilitate the meeting, and then my coworker, Daria. Daria and I predominantly work on most of the edits that are happening to the protected lands data that then feed into 30 by 30. So we do have a slide deck. I'll go over some information today, but I welcome you to drop in questions in chat or just unmute yourself if you prefer and chime in as you have questions. I am going to try to keep the presentation part of this on the shorter end so that folks do have time for their questions, and it's perfectly okay if your question is very specific to your agency. This is meant to be a bit of sort of like office hours help, of very one-on-one support if need be. So your questions may be relevant to others, and or we're happy to set up a time to talk with you one-on-one if you prefer a meeting to get more in depth about something that doesn't get answered. So with that, I think our participant list here is pretty stable on the numbers, so I'll go ahead and get started. So today is protected lands in 30 by 30. And the focus is going to be how to make sure the lands you have that are protected in fee and easement are properly accounted for in the databases. So as I noted, this is more of a data technical logistics webinar. We do not plan to get into the nuances of gap codes in this call. There are some meetings being scheduled for that currently. We can accept questions by email that will help facilitate more of those meetings when they're needed. But today is definitely more focused on getting your information to us so we can get them properly accounted in the databases. So for an agenda, as I said, hopefully won't take up too much time on the presentation part, and we'll move to questions. But I'll give you a quick recap. We went over in the last webinar of what goes into 30 by 30, how it gets in there, and how you can contribute if you think it needs to be changed or corrected or revised in any way. And then we'll give you an overview of how you could go through that workflow of submitting data to us. We have a couple of different options. I'll show you different ways you can view the data that's currently in CPAD and CCED, so you can see if they're correct, accurate, and current, or if you need revisions. We will call out some things that we know are common data issues or things you might want to look for in your lands to make sure those are accurate. And then some overview of when you submit back what you need to send us and what are the timelines in order to get those included in updates. So as a high level reminder, so 30 by 30 is trying to protect 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030. What we're working on today and what's reflected in CPAD and CCED are terrestrial lands, not coastal and water lands. Those are handled differently. So these are primarily terrestrial, and I say primarily because there may be areas in the bay and other that we need to have discussions on, but really mostly focused on inlands. So protected lands in 30 by 30, in order to be in 30 by 30, the first criteria is that you need to have your lands noted in CPAD and or CCED. And that means that they're protected either in fee, title, or easement, and sometimes both. So it can be one, other, or both that they're protected. We do have a whole website about the information about CPAD and CCED. Those are larger databases than get counted in 30 by 30. They're actually used for many things apart from 30 by 30, but they are statewide databases meant to track any and all of these protected lands. So something like recreation is certainly important to us, even if that's not the focus of the 30 by 30 and biodiversity. So we know that CPAD and CCD are quite good in the US. They're one of the best databases around, but we also know you guys are all actively protecting new lands, and sometimes information just isn't as current as we had hoped it would be. There are over 1,000 agencies that we're working with to get updates and information from constantly, so it is a rather large task. And the state is really expansive and diverse, so sometimes there might be things that are protected in a way that we didn't know of that we need to look into more. So every agency is unique, and that means that we're here to help you with the technical support also of getting your information into the two databases for the state. So we were hoping we could start with a chat here, and if folks could just give, I'd asked if you are able, you can put your name and the organization you're joining for today, but then also if you could put any notes about where you're at in the 30 by 30 process. So maybe if you've attended any of the webinars, either by us or anyone else, CNRA or other groups, if you've browsed around websites, if you've downloaded the data toolkits or other things, or even if you found that you've already tried some things and you're stuck, that would be helpful to know. So I'll give folks just a couple minutes here, and I'm just going to scan through who we have joining today.
Amanda, we've had 2 more people join just in the last like 30 seconds. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Great. For those that are just joining us now, today hopefully can be somewhat informal. So if you have questions and things you want to address, you can drop those in the chat at any time, or also feel free to unmute yourself and add them. So it looks like some people are familiar with the data, but haven't downloaded toolkits or have started revisions. Some folks have submitted information already last week. That's great. Information on working lands. Yes. So if you're in, I will call out, if you're a group that has working lands, in particular, those focused on agriculture and grazing, CCLT is hosting a webinar, which we'll be at also on the 30th, in which we'll get more into the gap code element of 30 by 30. So this would be the first step of making sure that your easements or fee properties are in one of the two databases, and then the gap coding discussions will be more on the 30th, just so you're aware of that. And all right, so it looks like people are sort of in a similar phase here. Most people have looked at least some things and submitted others. So let's see. Move my chat here. Okay, so I'll let Daria give sort of a quick high level of what we see as the workflow as we move ahead into updating lands for 30 by 30.
Okay, yeah, so this is really a 2-stage process. The first stage is to download the toolkit and then review and revise the data that we have of your lands in CPAD and CCD. So that means to carry out any attribute edits, any geometry edits to the data that will be in the toolkit. At that point, it would be great to return that data to us, and then we can quickly integrate those updates into CPAD and CCD, and we can send the toolkit back to you, or you can download it again from the website after we've made the updates. And at that point, you can start the second stage, which is to assign gap codes to your lands, to your now revised lands in the toolkit. And yeah, that's pretty much the workflow that we're looking for here.
Yeah, and one thing I will note is that we know it's a lot of information, especially for those agencies who have a lot of properties, and especially if they're quite different from each other. So if you want to submit your information at multiple times, like say you resolve half or a third of your properties, or you fix all the geometry and later add the gap codes, we're fine with you submitting information multiple times, so that you don't have to try to get it all at once and then make one large submission. You're welcome to do that also, but we just wanted to be flexible, knowing that some people probably have a lot of constraints on their time. So if you want to start by prioritizing and doing the most important or the easiest, or things you can get knocked out, we're happy to make those edits then, and then come back to them if and when you can do additional revisions. Okay, so I'm going to walk through 4 different ways you can look at the data, and I'll give you sort of the reasons you might choose any of them. You can choose more than one, but this might help you pick which one seems best for you. So the main one that we've developed as a part of the 30 by 30 effort is what we call a toolkit. So if you go to our website, which is here, and these slide decks again, Daria, can you put the link in the chat for the slide deck? That should already be open. Let us know if you can't view that on your own. But you can learn about the toolkit, but you can also download it. So you can just search by your agency land. So lands are classified within these zip files as those lands that your agency manages. So you can own and manage them. If you only manage but don't own, they'll still be included in your list. And what you'll get is a zip file that contains shapefiles of your fee properties and your easements, and also an Excel listing of those tables. So the nice part here are a couple of things. One is that if you only want to look at your own agency's properties, it's only going to include those records. So it's a subset or a filter. And the reason for that is because, like I mentioned earlier, there are over 1,000 agencies and many, many records across the whole state. So that is probably too much for you. We also have a ton of attributes that aren't as specific to 30 by 30, and they're great to get more information about, but they're not required in order to update. So this is sort of an easier way to know the filtered set of your lands and what's really important to look at. That being said, you can download any agency's data. So if you want other agencies, that's perfectly fine to download multiple agencies, and we'll walk through an option that gives you the full state. So if you prefer to have all the data, that's also an option. But one of the main key things here is that this information is updated each week. I believe it's on Tuesday that we're updating it now. But if you submit information to us, we then go through, make the edits that you've requested, and we can notify you when those are made. So you could come back the following week, re-download the data, and see that it looks the way you want it to. So if you have questions or concerns, or you want to see how it's progressed through the edits, we're happy to notify you when we've gotten to your agency's edits and made changes, so you could proof those if you wanted. So when you download it, this is how it will look. For those that are familiar with CPAD, we do include 2 geographic levels, and for those who don't, I'll explain that. One is that this reflects the park. It's the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve. So we do include a shapefile that has just one large polygon for the entire preserve. We call that the unit. But if you're interested, some agencies deal more with individual parcels within their properties. We do have what we call holdings level. And so you can see this smaller or thinner outline. Those are the individual parcels that build up to the larger park or property. So you can pick to look at either. Both are included in the toolkit when you download those. So you can choose which one is more relevant, or you can use both to review your lands. And then easements, because they're definitely different, and that's why we have them in a separate database, but those really just come in one layer, and we do ultimately aim to have all of those broken out by parcel when relevant, sometimes sub-parcel areas, because easements don't always apply to the full parcel. So that's just a little different. And again, here's the link for that if you want to go download it. These are the attributes that are included in those shapefiles when you download them. The ones here are the ones that we're hoping to get your input on, and we're talking about today, which is making sure if there's a relevant name for your park or property, it's good to have. If the public is allowed to access the property, that's either open, restricted, or closed. And we do have documentation about that if you have any questions. And then if you found, for example, you don't actually manage the property, we've incorrectly assigned you, you can tell us here, no, actually we don't, and we can change that assignment to someone else. And then also one thing that's been super helpful is knowing when a property is established. This is because people really want to look at change over time. When things become protected. And so having the actual date when the property became protected is super useful. And then we do have the acreage, just sometimes it's nice to have that number to make sure it's in the right ballpark, especially if you're looking at tabular data rather than spatial data. So the other option that I mentioned in passing a bit here was that if you want to look at the whole state, you can actually just download the full release. So this will give you this whole set of data shown here on this map. The latest release that we have is 2022B that came out in December of 2022. So if you download that, you will get all agencies, all data across the whole state. You can get both fee and easement data. And it does have the 3 geographic levels, so all the way down to the parcel geometry, sort of the park level, and then super units are even broader. So if something crosses a county line, or maybe there's mixed ownership, but it's managed as one large park, we merge them. So each of those are available. But what this doesn't include is if you sent us updates, a month ago and we told you we've made your revisions, they will not be shown in the release version until the June 2023 A release comes out. So the toolkit allows you to see the most recent data. And that's because it hasn't gone through our full QA to be released out into the wider public for statewide use. But this allows you the full state. So those are 2 different options there, and you can certainly do both. And then here's the link for downloading. And then with the official release, we have the manual that describes all the information. So for example, I talked about open access. This is a limited description, but there's even more depth, or anything you might want to learn, hopefully, about CPAD is included in there. If you want, you can look at these maps online. If you download the toolkit, you'll get an Excel table that lists all your properties also. And for each one, you can open a map. This opens our map collaborator. This is the same Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve. So you can pull it up on there if you don't want to open the files in GIS, the shape files. And then another option we do have is KML. Those aren't inherently included in your toolkit, but we're happy to provide them. We know a few agencies use them, but we didn't want to generate them for everyone and just cause extra file and confusion. But here's the email here, or you can email Daria directly. It's very easy for us to generate those. We're happy to send you KMLs if that's a better way for you to review your properties. And any of those ways, shapefiles, KMLs, tables, you can send any of those back to us in any of those formats. Like I said, we're trying to be very flexible in terms of knowing that each state is going to manage their data differently. So however you feel is the best way to send it to us, you're welcome to. So this is just a quick summary that the downloaded toolkits are agency specific with limited attributes. So those are the ones that we're really hoping you can focus on. And we update those weekly. So if and when we get your edits, we'll make those and let you know, and you can go back and look at those revisions. And it's obviously a smaller file size when we're looking at just one agency versus the whole state. If you want the whole state and all the attributes, you can go to the 2022B release. And then map collaborators, if you don't want to work with GIS software or you just want to look at something quickly, you can pop in, and that's also statewide. It goes off the 2022B release. So that allows you a quicker interaction. And then the request for KML. So those are the data viewing options. Any questions so far? I haven't looked at the chat, and also, like I said, feel free to unmute. There aren't a ton of us here, so it's perfectly manageable if folks prefer to speak or type, whichever you prefer. All right, must be all so obvious. So Daria, I'll let you go over those key elements we're looking for that we hope folks can make in the review of the data.
Yeah, so when you review and revise your data, we're definitely looking for any updates to either your attributes or your geometry. One second. So yeah, when it comes to attributes, what we really care about is changes to the property name, the level of access, if there's been changes to the owner or manager. We'd like to know about that too. For geometry edits and improvements, if we're missing any of your lands, we'd really like you to include, those feature shapes in there so that we can add them to CPAD or CCD. If we happen to have lands that you no longer own or manage and that we need to remove from CPAD and CCD, we'd like to know that too. And also, we have some specifics around alignment that I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into. So that's the next slide, Amanda.
Okay, great. I did want to just say there was one quick question in the chat that I'll address,
Oh,
which was, should you be correcting the number of polygons or parcels and how to fill in the holding ID? So if you find, let me just go back here. If you look at your park and perhaps it just had one large, even for the holdings, you could tell us, or if this was incorrect. Essentially what we have is assessor parcel data for the state that we can reference. So if it's just an update and you would like us to refresh to the parcels, you can just let us know that that needs to be done. You don't need to submit the actual data. You could just give us that comment. The holding ID is an automatic unique identifier that's created within the database when we generate the record for the first time. So you don't need to fill anything out for that. On the tables and things, you'll see the field, and that just allows us to reference it when we're trying to tie it back to the larger data set and make sure we get the correct record to edit. So hopefully that answers the question, but feel free to follow up in chat or by voice if not.
there's one more question that I think that's a good question. So if a property is transferred over, so it's still protected. If you know, I mean, obviously, if you have data on who you transferred it to, that would be great to include. Yeah, so we do want to keep, obviously, any properties that are still protected. So if you can provide us information on that, that would be great.
Yeah, so if you can tell us who the new organization agency is, we can get that switched over to the proper one. One other thing I will know is oftentimes we're notified by someone who acquires the land initially, but they know it will be transferred. If you want to let us know that it's pending a transfer, what we can do is put a note in our internal system. And if you have even an approximate like year, month, or somewhat of a loose date, then we know to go back and check it. But we can make that note so that we try to go back in the future and refresh that. So yeah, we do know that happens a fair amount where a lot of agencies will acquire land and then transfer it to different folks. So just let us know if that's happened and we need to correct it, or if you're making a new acquisition and you know it will happen, you can sort of pre-warn us that that's there.
Okay, so when it comes to making edits to your geometry, I want to make sure that everybody knows that most of the lands in CPAD and CCD are aligned to parcel data. So if you do have the capacity to align your land to the newest parcel data, we would obviously really appreciate that. This is here a situation where if we saw something like this, we would go ahead and align it to the newest parcels, just because it's fairly obvious that was the intent. In the next slide, you will see that obviously that's not always the case. There are situations where land is rather aligned to land features such as roads or creeks. And if that is how you want to keep it, and that's how it needs to be, instead of it being aligned to parcels, we would like it if you can put a note that just says to keep it aligned as it is. Otherwise, especially if it's not very obvious what it's supposed to be aligned to, we do default to aligning to parcels. So yeah, can we?
Yeah, and the reason a lot of these are not actually currently aligned is that this is a database that builds over time. And so we're sort of revisiting records as they need revisions. And so something like this may be close enough to correct that it just hasn't been looked at for sometimes even 10 years if it's a very stable property. And so now we basically have more information. We have the aerial imagery that's higher resolution. We now have access to parcels. When we started CPAD and CCED, we did not. So this just allows us to improve the accuracy as we're making other changes. So that's why if you see a record that looks like this, the reason it wasn't initially parcel aligned was we just didn't have that data at that point. So it may just be a case that we haven't looked at it for quite a while and we'd like to update it.
Okay, and the other geometry improvement is to, if you do have capacity, before you send us the data, to clean up any overlaps. This is something that is an issue in CPAT and CCD. We do have a lot of overlaps in the data that we do try to clean up as much as we can. But if you do have capacity, we would love it if you can clean up overlaps. It would just be very, very helpful. And yeah, I think, is there one more slide after that? Or,
yeah, and
sorry.
we do have one other.
Okay.
We do have one question here in the chat also about deconflict in the database, and I think this is in reference to, there are times where we'll zoom to a property and identify the parcel and find a different owner, or we'll find something that indicates that we don't have it quite right. So when we discover those errors ourselves, we do try to research them, and that generally means online research and then following up. You know, if there's a deed or something official, it's pretty easy to determine. If we can't find the answer or it's not really definitive, we'll reach out to the agencies involved. So either who previously was assigned as an owner or manager, or who's currently listed in the assessor parcel. So yes, there are conflicts, but we don't do regular checks to look for things like transfers and data. So if you can highlight them for us, we'll find them faster. And so then in terms of what to send, we'll take almost anything. I don't know if I should be so clear about that, but so one thing I do want to say very specifically is if your agency already has its own data specific, especially GIS, we're not asking you to recreate it. You don't need to put it into some magical format or system or toolkit. We're happy to take what you already have. What we do request is notes or information. So if you have metadata that tell us, you know, what your fields mean, or when you last updated, or things that you know might be issues, those are all really helpful to have. But don't feel that you need to use this specific toolkit to send those exact files back or those formats. You're welcome to send other formats as you have. So like I said, if you already have your own GIS file and you want to send us that, please do. Don't spend your efforts recreating that. We would just ask instead that you give us notes or information, or be available for a quick call if things come up that we just can't sort out. But if you don't have GIS, toolkits might be the right way for you to go, where you can go grab those GIS files as a starting place. Also, if you have supporting files like PDFs or tables or website links, those are all welcome things to have. And yes, if you're available for follow-up questions, if there are particularly difficult things to explain or understand, that's super helpful. And if you have metadata, sometimes those can pre-explain it so that we can hassle you less about getting that information. And so then I think the main last slide we have really here for today is the timeline. So the 31st is the last sort of official day that we're collecting data to put into the June release of CPAT and CCED. And that's a bit of an unknown. I think right now we're keeping up fairly well with submissions that are coming in. So if you've submitted something by now, there's a really good chance we'll get it in there, or at least close to all of those edits in by the June release. And we can probably accept more before then. So do send them if you happen to have them ready. The key thing though is if your edits are in relation to 30 by 30, and that is your main concern or objective, they are not using the June release at CNRA to run an update. They will not be doing their update till the end of the year. So technically you really do have until October 31st. So I want to call out that you're welcome to try to make this earlier deadline, but that will not, even if you don't make that deadline, the next 30 by 30 update could still reflect your edits as long as you get them to us by late October. So I think that's really sort of the core content that we hoped to go through today. And then we were thinking that if folks wanted to ask specific questions and or if you just want to let us know that you want to set up a one-on-one meeting, we're happy to get a list of those folks so that we can start knowing who to reach out to and arrange those with. I did scan that participant list, and then folks said they've been added, and I'm happy to see a lot of you are folks we've already been in communication and working with. So yeah, any questions for anyone?
There's a hand question raised? Yeah.
Hi, this is Steve. I'm in Sacramento.
Hello.
And I think our data is pretty good with the Conservancy, but we have a county conservation agency and there's other mitigation banks and things like that that we're aware of that I don't think are in the database. Do you want us to send those as well to add into the
Yeah.
list?
That is a great question. And certainly, so you can definitely feel free to send us information that relates to another agency, especially if it's someone you work with or or you're more able to send that information. All the information that we do get that comes in is vetted. We don't just absorb everything in. We check to make sure that it looks logical and came from a credible source. So if you're submitting for an agency that you work within the county and have relations, that's fine. But if we just get, and we do just get average person input on the website, but those get extra vetting to make sure they're correct. And if there's any question, we reach out to that agency.
Okay, great. We'll try and send in additional properties then.
Thank you. Yeah, and mitigation properties are one that we're starting to work on more because they're coming up more and more within 30 by 30, and there's some discussion needed as to how those get counted. And but having the information is always sort of the first key thing. So if you're able to send us that, we can get them into the database before those decisions get made.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have someone being asked to add to the list. We're happy to do that. For Kevin, we'll get you added. And for those of you who might not have heard earlier, didn't know, their CCLT is also having a working lands that's focused on ag and grazing properties and how gap codes will be assigned to those. That's on the 30th. So if that's helpful, informative, please come to that. That is going to be a discussion, and we welcome you to bring your scenarios or questions about properties you have, and we might be able to look through some individual cases through that meeting. And so, yeah, I think we plan to be here and around if people have questions, but that was sort of the bulk of what we plan to go through today. And then also we have another one on Wednesday for anybody who might be interested in joining.
I have another question too that goes more to using the data for outreach. I'm wondering if there's any regions that I guess a lot of the regions can have a self-defined area that they then report on what their percentage is. I'm wondering if there's examples of how that's been done, maybe in the Bay Area with Together Bay Area or something. What is some of the best examples you've seen of
Yeah,
saying we're at this point and we want to get to 30 by 30, and this mapping is helping us find our baseline.
yeah, so definitely the Together Bay Area, and I think if you look at the way they measure protection, which is a little bit different than 30 by 30, they think they're already there, which makes sense. I think they are. But yes, there are definitely regional focuses. I just met with a person who leads a group of Southern California folks, and so it was a mix of agency types, but they were talking about the region of SoCal. So hopefully there'll be something coming up for that. But if folks know of ones that already exist that we should be working with, or if you would like us to facilitate discussions for some of those, feel free to suggest it either now in chat or follow up by email. I know that both CCLT and GreenInfo are open to having additional groups, working groups, meetings, webinars to bring folks together.
Okay, thank you. It's super helpful.
And the one in SoCal, I believe it was someone out of the Sierra Club, but unfortunately I don't have the name in front of me of the working group, but it did involve like Mojave Desert Land Trust, some Sierra Club folks, and it was about a dozen different groups there. So I had asked that they get in touch with CCLT, so hopefully that'll help coordinate things. Let's see, once the next cohort of updates are made, they'll be in it. So now there's a discussion on the dashboard. So the ones for CPAD and CCED will get updated in June. So things like Map Collaborator, Park Info, data downloads. The CNRA ones are not anticipated until spring of next year. So just under a year. And I'll make note that a Sacramento area would be a good group to get together. Any other thoughts? Oh, I think Beth, you had a question. Did you want to unmute or type?
Yes. Thank you, Amanda. And I apologize that I joined a few minutes late. So if
No worries.
this, forgive me. So I downloaded our toolkit, which is fantastic. And it looks like a lot of our data is in there. So it looks like I just need to assign the gap codes, which are all 0. So kind of starting from scratch with that and assigning it per property. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So my recollection is that we've worked together on basically all of the fee and easement revisions. So that means hopefully when you download the toolkit, those get refreshed weekly. And so hopefully those all are reflected in there as you expected. So yes, your next step would be gap codes. And so you have time until essentially late October to get those assigned. And also, we're not really getting into gap codes too much today, but yes, if they're 0s or 4, it's really just that we don't have data. We've really only taken federal level ownership and management and used that to apply gap codes. So if your gap code is not what you expect, we trust that you know, and we will fix that. It is just that we haven't gotten to it. And unfortunately, with the gap system, 4 and no data are represented the same. So it's not that we really think you're a 4. It's probably no data.
Okay.
But yes, in terms of logistics, yes, you could use then the Excel file or the shape files to let us know the gap code, the gap assignments, and you can have mixed gap codes within a property. And there will be more webinars about gap codes because those are harder.
Yeah. I do have a question about gap code. Should I save that for another time?
Yeah, unfortunately, I probably can't answer it. What I will say are a few things. One is that if you assign them once, you can reassign them in the future. So if you don't get them right, that's perfectly fine. You can tell us either by percentages if you want different codes within the same property, or give all these a 2, these a half 2, half 3. So we're pretty flexible on that. And the way we bring the information in is fairly automated from that Excel table. So as long as we can work with you to make sure you either use that, or we can help you if you need some adjusting, it's a quick refresh to pull in updated gap codes. So you're not stuck with them forever. Once you submit them once, we can make revisions and updates.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. And I think, Brandon, did you have a question? I think I see hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious, somebody mentioned this earlier. CCED includes easements that are for public access only, or at least are for public access and maybe something else.
No, they do include closed also and restricted.
Right, but so access. So I guess the point I'm getting at is that CCED includes some easements that are only for public access. Is that true?
In terms of like the easement is there in terms of being able to access the property, like for a trail or public visitation versus biodiversity.
Right.
Yes. So both CPAD and CCED are meant to be broader data sets, and they are, that have a lot more uses. So what we try to do is work with things like open access and types and gap codes so that folks can filter out what works for their analysis.
Okay, so that's kind of what I'm getting at. I'm wondering if there's a way to filter out easements that are only for public access from the rest of the data set.
Not entirely inherently, and I think this would be one for us to have a good conversation that would probably extend beyond this. I think we could start to get at it, and then from there further hone down. Once gap codes are in, that would be easier, but as they are now, no. I will say also, CPAD has been around much longer than CCED, and it has taken a lot more time to get information about easements, and it's harder to find information about easements. So in general, things that deal with CCED are not going to be as refined. But that's definitely somewhere that we really want to make efforts, and CNRA really wants to focus on for 30 by 30. But that being said, yeah, it's much more limited. And so make sure you look at those to make sure your own are right. And then if you want to work with us, Brandon, we could start to see if there was a way we could work around to get to the subset you're interested in, and or build something in so that over time, as the data improves, you would be able to do that.
Thanks for that great answer. I'll definitely follow up.
Cool, thanks. Any other questions for anybody? Otherwise, I might have to let Beth ask her gap question. You can go ahead, and if I know how to answer it, I will. But it.
Okay, well, the first question I ran into with trying to assign my own gap codes was of what is a legally enforceable management plan versus I forget what the other term was, institutionally acceptable or something management plan. How do I know if it's legally?
Yeah, this is
defendable?
one. Yeah, this is one we've been sort of working around and trying to generalize. I think it's starting to come around to the fact that we're looking for something that is pretty, I don't know if obvious is the right word, but like if you have a deed and it's written into the deed that if you sell it, it has to remain in public use, or it has to with biodiversity. I have heard there are agencies that don't actually have specific management plans per property, but that's because they work with the state, and the state has language at a larger level that applies to all their properties. And we have heard that's fine. You don't need, if it's mandated by something higher that's going to apply by default, that's okay also. It's not going to be a checkbox like you have to send some legal specific form. What we're looking for is consistent decision making and something that is defensible, that it is intended to be biodiversity in perpetuity, which is still a bit vague. I apologize.
That's okay. It's probably a, kind of know it when you see it thing, I guess, but definitely going through per property. We have different types of management plans for different properties. So just wondering if there's anything more specific on that, but.
Yeah, and we are asking and working with CNRA and USGS folks to get examples of things that seem to be common, and then also asking questions, and we are happy to collect those questions. So if you have an example that you don't really know if it fits, feel free to email Daria, myself, or this general email, and we will use that as an example to ask them and get feedback, and then hopefully get that posted. We do try to post information. We started frequently asked questions on our website. Let me pull that over here. So as we start to get some of those answers, hopefully we'll build this out.
Great. Yeah, and it's there's so much information on there. You guys have put together a really helpful site. Thank you.
There's a lot. We hopefully it's organized. Joseph, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to tell Beth that I'm going through our easement documents. So if it's a conservation easement document, sometimes it also helps you define which percentage of the easement is what gap code as well. And it might be defining the building envelope or specific acres and they're specifically for biodiversity, or some that may be including access or some type of recreation. So those documents help you first define the legal description that you were asking about, and then they also can help you piece out which part might be 1, 2, 3, or 4. Because we have a couple properties we found that there's some 3 and 4 status within that, while 80% of it's 1 or 2.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, Joseph.
And Daria did remind us here in the chat that we do have a field called easement type within the data. So it may be of some help if you're trying to filter down to those that are, for example, like trail access. That being said, we have not found any consistent even set of categories that are used. So those are more of an indication. So you can use those as sort of an informing piece of information, but they will not be definitive. We wish they would be. We've tried to make that happen, but unfortunately that structure doesn't exist within easements that we've been able to find. Anybody else have questions for us? I think we had up to an hour, so we're happy to hang around if there are. Otherwise, people probably want to get on with their Monday afternoon. Feel free to drop off if and when you want. That's totally fine. Otherwise, we'll just hang out and make sure here if questions do come up. And definitely email us, call us. Daria and I are always happy to chat. One-on-one support is welcome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome, everybody.
That's just about everybody. Let's see.